Ever watch The Economy and just feel like you're missing something big?
Mm.
Like the major events, these sudden shifts, they don't quite seem to fit the neat, rational explanations we usually hear.
Yeah, absolutely. It often feels like there are these invisible forces at play.
Right. Like, think back to the 2008 financial crisis, that massive global shock. It felt like this sudden, almost jarring realization.
Mm-hmm.
A bit like that scene the authors mentioned from Henry James' The Golden Bowl, where suddenly everything just clicks into a new, maybe disturbing focus for a character. Why do these huge, unpredictable things happen?
Well, the traditional economic playbook tells us that big decisions in business, finance, government, they're mostly based on cool, rational analysis. Looking at the data.
The classic view, going back to Adam Smith, right? The invisible hand. Rational folks making rational choices. And markets, ideally, sort everything out.
Yeah.
Leading to full employment if you just leave them alone.
Exactly. People weigh the pros and cons, look at the numbers, act in their best interest, and it should all balance out.
But, our source material for this deep dive, this fascinating work by Nobel laureates George Akerlof and Robert Shiller, it really leans into that feeling that something's, missing from that purely rational picture.
It does. They argue pretty forcefully that major economic and financial choices are often driven by these deeply psychological, sometimes irrational factors, things they group together and call animal spirits.
Animal spirits, okay. So what exactly does that mean?
It's about the non-rational side of our decision-making. Things like intuition, fear, gut feelings, maybe waves of optimism or pessimism, trust or distrust, hope, faith. Akerlof and Shiller say these aren't just small biases, they're fundamental drivers, especially for the big swings.
So our goal here, our mission for this deep dive, is to really unpack what these animal spirits are using their framework. We want to explore how this idea gives us a more, complete picture of why economies act the way they do.
And use that understanding to tackle some really big, persistent questions the authors themselves raise.
Yeah, like why do economies sometimes just collapse into depressions?
Yeah.
Why do central banks seem to have so much power? Why is there still unemployment?
Why does saving seem so, arbitrary for so many people? Why do housing markets go through these wild boom and bust cycles?
And a really tough one. Why does poverty seem so persistently concentrated among certain minority groups? Let's dive in.
Okay. So, Akerlof and Shiller identify 5 key animal spirits. These are the core psychological forces they see shaping economic reality.
And the first one, they really stress this, it's the absolute foundation. Confidence.
Confidence. And it's more than just feeling good about things. It's that underlying willingness to actually act, to invest money, to spend, to hire someone that goes beyond just a strict rational calculation of expected profit or return.
So when people feel confident,
the economy gets a boost, businesses expand, people buy cars, houses, washing machines. There's an energy.
But the flip side is just as powerful, maybe even more so.
Oh, definitely. It creates this feedback loop. When confidence disappears, people pull back. Hard. They stop spending on anything non-essential, they sell stocks, businesses freeze hiring, or even lay people off.
And it's not just a measured response to bad news, is it?
Often not. It can be driven by this contagious fear, this wave of uncertainty. And that reaction magnifies the initial problem. It can turn a downturn into a full-blown crisis. You see these cycles throughout history, periods of almost irrational exuberance, followed by crashes, fueled by a sudden collective loss of nerve.
They use some vivid images, like finding abandoned train tracks out in the middle of nowhere, someone's ambitious, confident dream turned to rust.
Or think way back, 17th century Holland. The tulip bubble, people paying fortunes for a single bulb based purely on the belief someone else would pay even more. It seems crazy now, but...
Even Isaac Newton got caught up in a bubble, didn't he? The South Sea bubble. Lost a lot of money.
He did. Famously said he could calculate the motion of heavenly bodies, but not the madness of people. Shows how powerful that collective confidence or lack of it can be.
And more recently, they point to a specific day in 2008.
September 29th, 2008. The day the U.S. Congress first voted down the TARP bailout package. Remember that?
Oh, yes.
The Dow Jones just plunged, almost 800 points. Markets globally tanked. That single political act shattered confidence instantly. Suddenly, the idea of another Great Depression felt frighteningly real. It shows how fast that essential spirit can just evaporate.
So it's this underlying tide of hope or fear, not just cold calculation, that really moves the needle.
That's the core idea. Okay, the second animal spirit is fairness, or equidad, as they note in Spanish.
Fairness. That feels Different. More like an ethical thing. How does fairness affect hard-nosed economic stuff like wages and prices?
Well, it turns out our sense of what's fair profoundly shapes how we see transactions and what we expect from them, which then ripples through the economy. They use a great example from Kahneman, Netsch, and Thaler.
The beer on the beach experiment.
That's the one. Imagine you're roasting on a beach, desperate for a cold beer. How much would you pay? Now, does your maximum price change if you know your friend is getting it from a little rundown grocery store versus a fancy resort hotel bar right there?
Uh-huh. Instinctively, you'd probably stomach a higher price from the fancy hotel, even for the exact same beer.
Exactly. The experiment showed people consistently set a higher maximum price if they thought it came from the hotel. Their idea of a fair price was totally shaped by the context, the seller's perceived costs or status, not just their own thirst or the beer's intrinsic value.
That definitely pushes back on the idea that we're all just ruthless calculators trying to get the absolute lowest price no matter what.
It really does, and it goes beyond just buying beer. Sociologists like Peter Blau studied how government officials sometimes trade favors or information based on social dynamics, maybe avoiding asking a supervisor, not just pure quid pro quo value. And think about experiments by people like Ernst Fair. They show people aren't purely selfish. We get genuinely upset if we feel treated unfairly. We'll even pay a price ourselves, accept a smaller gain, or even a loss just to punish someone we think acted dishonestly.
So this feeling of fairness, it's not just fluff. It actually influences bargaining, how wages get set, how companies price things.
Yeah.
Ways that the simple supply and demand model might miss.
Precisely. Okay, moving on. The third spirit is corruption and antisocial behavior.
Now that one sounds less like a spirit and more like, well, just bad behavior.
Yeah.
Or crime.
Well, the way they frame it is as this pervasive temptation that's kind of inherent in capitalism, especially when people are managing other people's money.
Right, like CEOs of public companies or bankers using depositors' funds.
Exactly. There's always this pull, this temptation for those in charge to find clever ways to enrich themselves, maybe through complex deals, financial engineering, or just bending the rules instead of the harder, maybe slower path of just building solid long-term value for the actual owners or depositors.
And this stuff often comes to light when the economy turns down, doesn't it?
Very often. Complexity can be a great smokescreen for hiding what are sometimes pretty simple violations of accounting or fiduciary duty. The savings and loan crisis in the late 80s, early 90s is a key example.
The S&L crisis, yeah, cost a fortune.
It did. About $140 billion in taxpayer money eventually. A big part of the problem was that government deposit insurance meant ordinary depositors didn't really have to worry if their S&L was sound. They were covered.
Which made the S&Ls vulnerable.
Easy targets for unscrupulous operators. People came in, used accounting gimmicks, made risky loans, often benefiting themselves, basically looted the institutions knowing the government would pick up the tab. Figures like Michael Milken and the high-yield junk bond market played a role in fueling some of that. They even had to create a whole new government agency, the Resolution Trust Corporation, just to clean up the mess.
And then, fast forward about a decade, Enron, around the 2001 recession. Similar dynamics.
Absolutely. Enron became the poster child for pushing accounting rules to the absolute limit and beyond. Things like mark-to-market accounting, where they booked profits on long-term deals immediately, even if the money hadn't come in yet. It created this illusion of massive, unstoppable growth.
Until it wasn't real.
Until the whole house of cards collapsed. The authors argue these aren't just isolated incidents. They reflect a systemic temptation towards corruption and self-dealing that festers, often hidden in boom times, but gets painfully exposed when the economy sours, causing huge damage and destroying confidence.
Which then feeds back into that first spirit, confidence. A vicious cycle again.
Exactly. Okay, our fourth animal spirit. Money illusion.
Money illusion. Is that basically just people not understanding inflation?
Pretty much. Or deflation, for that matter. It's the failure to consistently think about and account for the changing real purchasing power of money. The economist Irving Fisher wrote a whole book about it back in 1928, The Money Illusion.
You had an example, right? Cora.
Yes, Cora. She inherited $50,000 in bonds. Sounds good. Over 20 years, the bonds still said $50,000. The nominal value, the number, was unchanged.
Right.
But, as Fisher pointed out, over those same 20 years, the general price level had quadrupled. So while her statement said $50,000, what that money could actually buy had crashed. Her real wealth plummeted, but she was under the illusion it was stable because the dollar figure looked the same.
So we tend to focus on the number of dollars, euros, whatever, not what they actually purchase.
That seems to be a very strong human tendency. Even the great John Maynard Keynes thought workers often didn't fully factor expected inflation into their wage demands. Now, later economists like Milton Friedman, with his natural rate theory, argued rational people would focus on real wages. They'd demand nominal wage increases to compensate for expected inflation.
But Akerlof and Shiller argue the real world isn't always that perfectly rational.
Yeah. The evidence suggests money illusion is pretty persistent. Look at labor contracts, for instance. They cite data from Canada between the mid-70s and 2000. Only about 19% of major union contracts had automatic cost of living adjustments, CLA clauses that fully indexed wages to inflation.
Only 19%, that's low.
It is. And even those often had thresholds, like inflation had to hit 3% before the CLA kicked in. It suggests wage bargaining isn't always about precisely maintaining real purchasing power.
And what about wage cuts?
That's maybe even stronger evidence. There's tremendous resistance to nominal wage cuts, cutting the actual dollar amount someone is paid. People hate it, even if prices are falling, deflation, so their real wage might stay the same or even go up. It feels like a violation, an insult.
And prices themselves can be sticky. They don't always adjust smoothly.
Right. There's research, like Dennis Carlton's study on industrial prices, showing that prices for many manufactured goods stay fixed for surprisingly long periods, sometimes months or even over a year, even when costs are changing. This stickiness in both wages and prices, this resistance to downward nominal adjustment, is a key sign of money illusion at work.
And our whole accounting system is based on nominal dollars, isn't it?
Largely, yes. Which reinforces this tendency to think in nominal terms. So this illusion isn't just a psychological quirk. It has really concrete effects on how labor markets clear or fail to clear and how businesses set prices.
Okay. That makes sense. It sounds like it gums up the works of the perfectly adjusting market.
It certainly can. All right, finally, the fifth animal spirit is narratives. Stories.
Stories? You mean like fiction? Or gossip?
Yeah, more fundamental than that. It's about how our brains are structured to think. Psychologists like Roger Schenck and Robert Abelson argue we naturally process information, make sense of the world, and remember things in terms of stories, sequences of events, cause and effect, motivations. These narratives shape our identity, what motivates us, how we perceive reality itself.
Like Nassim Taleb talks about in Fooled by Randomness, we impose stories on random events to make them seem less random.
Exactly. We see patterns and causal links where there might just be chance. And people have even tried to classify these basic story structures. Georges Colty claimed there were only 36 dramatic situations. Ronald Tobias suggested 20 master plots. The point is, stories are fundamental cognitive tools.
Okay, but how does that connect to the economy?
These stories become a form of social memory and expectation. Past economic events aren't just abstract data points. They're remembered and retold as powerful stories that can dramatically influence how people behave now.
Can you give an example?
Think about financial panics. The authors suggest the intense fear during the Panic of 1893 wasn't just about the immediate situation. It was amplified by the vivid stories and shared memories people had of earlier panics in 1873 and 1884. That narrative of this is what happens in a panic made people much quicker to, well, panic.
That's a powerful feedback loop, too. Stories driving behavior that confirms the story.
Precisely. They even offer this interesting, maybe speculative, cultural observation about card games.
Oh yeah, Bridge versus Texas Hold'em.
Right. Not saying one caused the other, but it's suggestive. Bridge, popular in the mid-20th century, is very social, cooperative, usually not played for high stakes. Contrast that with the rise of Texas. Hold'em, highly individualistic, focused on bluffing, deception, often played for serious money. Does that shift mirror broader changes in business culture? Maybe. It's food for thought.
And they talk about national economic stories, too.
Yes, this is crucial. The narrative a country tells itself about its economy can have huge consequences. They contrast Mexico under President López Portillo, where an overblown story about oil wealth led to a boom based on borrowing against unrealistic expectations, followed by a painful collapse.
Yes.
With Japan's auto industry, especially Toyota, their success was built partly on a strong internal narrative, a culture emphasizing self-esteem, intense collaboration, they liken it to chain haiku poetry, company loyalty, lifetime employment ideals. This story, going back generations, fostered incredible dedication and quality.
In Argentina.
Their example of Argentina's Ike auto plant suggests that despite government backing, it lacked that deep, shared narrative connecting individual effort to collective success. It was more top-down, reliant on imported management, and didn't seem to inspire the same level of commitment. The underlying story matters.
Even Jack Welch at GE seemed to tap into this, didn't he? Focusing on people over numbers.
He apparently prioritized observing his people, understanding their motivation, their language of the heart, believing that was the real engine of growth, not just GDP forecasts. He supposedly dismissed complex financial projections sometimes, looking for the human energy, the belief. Because these stories, these narratives we tell ourselves individually and collectively, they shape our expectations, guide our actions, and ultimately drive massive economic outcomes.
Wow. Okay, so it's really clear. These 5 spirits: confidence, fairness, corruption, money illusion, and narratives, they aren't just footnotes. They feel like fundamental forces.
That's the argument.
So how do they help us answer those big, persistent economic questions we started with?
Right, let's connect the dots first. Why do economies fall into deep depressions or recessions? The standard models sometimes struggle to explain the sheer depth and suddenness.
But adding animal spirits gives a richer explanation.
Absolutely. Akerlof and Shiller argue severe downturns often kick off with a dramatic collapse in confidence. That's the trigger. People slam the brakes on spending and investment. This sudden stop often exposes underlying corruption or shady practices that were hidden during the good times, which further crushes trust. Then, the downturn gets prolonged because wages and prices are sticky. They don't adjust downwards easily. Why? Because of concerns about fairness, people refusing nominal wage cuts, and money illusion, focusing on the dollar amount, not real value.
And the panic itself.
That gets amplified by contagious narratives and the social memory of past crises, like we talked about with the 1893 panic. It becomes this perfect storm, a cascade of these psychological factors interacting. Then 1890s depression, the 1990-91 recession linked to the S&L cleanup, the 2001 recession after the dot-com bust, and Enron. Animal spirits were arguably central to all of them.
So it's not just a rational market finding a new equilibrium. It's a psychological meltdown.
That's a good way to put it. Okay, next. Why do central banks matter so much? If markets are rational, why do we need these powerful institutions intervening?
Yeah, the simple view is they just fiddle with interest rates or the money supply, like adding a bit more salt to the soup.
Right, like it's purely mechanical. But the authors argue their huge importance comes from their ability to manage systemic risk and counteract financial panics, precisely those moments when animal spirits, especially fear and collapsing confidence, threaten to take down the entire financial system.
Like stopping bank runs.
Historically, yes. A run on one bank, fueled by fear and rumor narratives, could spread contagiously, causing widespread bank failures. A central bank, acting as a lender of last resort, can break that cycle by providing liquidity and restoring confidence.
And we saw them doing much more than that in 2008, didn't we?
Absolutely. The Fed's actions were unprecedented. They had to essentially invent new tools on the spot. Programs like TALF, the term asset-backed securities loan facility, that wasn't just general liquidity. It was targeted lending to restart specific markets that had frozen solid, like those for auto loans, student loans, small business loans.
Because confidence had just vanished in those sectors.
Completely. They were dealing with panic and contagion in the complex shadow banking system, parts of a financial world that weren't well regulated. The fact that TALF involved the treasury sharing risk shows how complex and serious the situation was. It wasn't just tweaking rates, it was active crisis management, trying to directly combat the collapse in confidence and break the panic narrative. Other countries' experiences, like Sweden using state ownership during its crisis, or Japan's long battle with deflation, also highlight this crucial role of managing crises fueled by these psychological forces.
It really sounds like a huge part of their job, especially in a crisis, is managing the animal spirits themselves, trying to restore trust.
I think that's a key insight, yes. All right, what about unemployment? Why does it persist? Classical economics says wages should just fall until everyone who wants a job can find one.
The market clearing wage.
Yeah.
But clearly that doesn't always happen. We have persistent unemployment.
Right. So the authors bring in the efficiency wage theory. The basic idea is that employers often pay more than the bare minimum required to fill a position.
Why would they do that?
Well, one reason, from Shapiro and Stiglitz, is to discourage shirking. If you pay just the market clearing wage, getting fired isn't a big deal. The worker can easily find a similar job elsewhere. But if you pay above market, losing that job hurts. So workers are more motivated to work hard and stay put.
Okay, so it's about incentives.
Yes, but it's also about morale, fairness, and reciprocity. Employers might pay more because they feel it's the right thing to do or because it fosters loyalty and better performance. And crucially, as we discussed with money illusion and fairness, workers and employers show strong resistance to nominal wage cuts.
Even if inflation is 0 or negative.
Even then, cutting the dollar figure feels unfair, disrespectful. This downward wage rigidity, driven by money illusion and fairness concerns, stops the labor market from fully clearing, leading to unemployment people willing to work at the prevailing real wage who can't find jobs because nominal wages won't fall.
They mentioned the strikes in 1894 during that depression. Workers chose unemployment over accepting nominal cuts, even though prices had fallen.
Exactly. The perceived unfairness, the blow to their status, mattered more than a purely rational calculation of purchasing power. And they note how Canada's experience in the 1990s didn't neatly fit the standard Phillips curve trade-off between inflation and unemployment, again suggesting more complex forces like these spirits are at play.
Okay. Next big puzzle. Why is saving so arbitrary? Why do saving rates vary so much?
The standard theory here is the life cycle hypothesis from Modigliani, Bloomberg, Friedman. It suggests people rationally plan their saving and spending over their whole lives. You save a lot during your peak earning years to smooth consumption and fund retirement.
Sounds logical, but
it doesn't really explain the huge variation we see. Why do some people save diligently while others with similar incomes save almost nothing? Why do national saving rates differ so dramatically? That perfect, rational, forward-looking optimization doesn't seem to be the whole story.
So what's the animal spirit's take?
They argue that planning for the distant future is just really hard for us psychologically. It's difficult to truly connect with our future self decades down the line and make consistent sacrifices now. So instead of complex calculations, our saving behavior is often driven by simpler heuristics, rules of thumb, emotional cues, and especially by prevailing narratives.
Narratives about saving.
Yeah, maybe personal stories like, I deserve to enjoy life now, or I'll start saving seriously next year, or maybe broader cultural narratives. They speculate that the perceived identity of being American versus being Chinese, shaped by different cultural histories and norms around thrift and consumption, might play a big role in national saving patterns.
That makes intuitive sense. Saving feels less like optimization and more like habits or cultural pressure.
Exactly. Which helps explain why small nudges like Richard Thaler and Shlomo Benarsi's Save More Tomorrow plan, where people commit future pay raises to savings, can be surprisingly effective. If we were all perfect optimizers, those little tricks wouldn't work so well.
Keynes also thought consumption was pretty automatic, right? Reacting to current income.
He did. He saw it responding as a rule and on average to income changes, not necessarily as part of some grand lifetime plan. The very fact that governments everywhere feel the need for mandatory retirement savings programs like Social Security is almost an admission that, left to our own devices, driven by short-term impulses and narratives, many of us just won't save enough.
And those differences in saving, driven by psychology and culture, have massive long-term effects on national wealth and growth, thinking about places like China or Singapore versus others.
Huge effects. Okay, let's tackle housing cycles. Those booms and busts seem particularly wild.
Yeah, they often feel disconnected from actual rental values or building costs.
The authors argue these cycles are heavily driven by confidence and, again, powerful narratives, especially the narrative that housing prices always go up.
That's a pervasive one.
It is. And when prices are rising, this story gains traction, fuels optimism, confidence, leads to more buying, pushes prices higher, which reinforces the story. Another feedback loop. People start buying not just for a place to live, but as a speculative investment, based purely on the belief that prices will keep climbing.
Even though, historically, long-term real housing prices haven't actually risen that dramatically in many places.
Exactly. They point out that U.S. housing prices in real terms barely grew between 1900 and 2000. Even agricultural land hasn't kept pace with overall economic growth. Yet the narrative of housing as this uniquely safe, can't-lose investment persists and periodically fuels these speculative bubbles.
So it's the subprime crisis that kicked off the 2008 crash was basically this process on steroids.
That's a big part of their argument. Yes, there were complex financial instruments, failures and guarantees, the shadow banking system, regulators falling behind. But the underlying fuel for the boom that made all those risky mortgages seem viable was this surge in confidence and the widespread belief, the narrative, that house prices could only go up.
And they mentioned the role of government agencies like Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac in stabilizing things afterwards.
Yes, highlighting that the market, left to its own devices when dominated by these spirits, isn't necessarily self-correcting. They even float the idea of potentially needing new public institutions specifically designed to manage credit risk better in the future, implicitly acknowledging the market's potential for irrationality fueled by these psychological tides.
It really shows how these spirits can inflate asset bubbles far beyond fundamental value.
Definitely. Okay, the last big question, and it's a really complex one. Why does poverty seem concentrated among specific minority groups? We need to be clear here. We're presenting the author's argument based on their interpretation of the sources.
Understood. It's about their framework.
Their argument is that for certain groups, particularly African Americans and Native Americans in the U.S. context, persistent poverty isn't just about current economic opportunities or individual choices. It's deeply intertwined with a unique history of injustice, discrimination, and systemic inequality. This history, they argue, creates what they call an identity disadvantage.
An identity disadvantage. What does that mean in practice?
It means that the historical experience shapes a different internal narrative about one's place in society, one's prospects, and how the world works, compared to the dominant narratives available to, say, the white majority or even many immigrant groups who arrived later without that specific legacy.
They cite sociological work.
Yes, particularly Michel Lamont's studies comparing white and black working-class men. Lamont found, according to the authors, that white workers often attributed their struggles to bad luck or individual factors, within a general belief that the system itself was fundamentally fair and offered opportunity.
But the narrative was different for black workers in her study.
The authors convey that the narrative among many black working men was often one of us versus them, a feeling that the system itself was structured against them, shaped by historical and ongoing discrimination. This perception, rooted in real historical experience, meant that achieving even basic societal success often required, as the authors put it, developing an exceptional level of independence and navigating obstacles others didn't face. They point to stark statistics, like vastly higher incarceration rates for black men compared to others, as reflecting aspects of this different reality.
And they contrast statistical analysis with the deeper ethnographic studies.
Right. They mention the debate around affirmative action, contrasting purely statistical analyses, like those by the Thurnstroms, with more qualitative, in-depth work like David Shipler's book, A Country of Strangers, which captures lived experiences through interviews and observation.
And the author's point is?
Their point, based on the source material, is that statistics alone, while crucial, may miss the vital role of these deeply ingrained narratives, emotions, and perspectives shaped by history. Understanding this psychological and identity dimension, they argue, is essential to grasp why poverty and inequality persist so stubbornly for certain groups, and why policies like affirmative action are seen by some as attempts to address this deeper historical divide, a divide that creates almost different operating realities based on different default narratives.
So even something as starkly economic as persistent poverty is deeply influenced by these non-economic forces, history, identity, and the stories people inherit and tell themselves.
That's the core of their argument on this specific point, drawing from their sources.
Wow. Okay, so let's just take a breath and pull this together. It feels like the main message is that while traditional economics gives us valuable tools, Adam Smith was right about markets being powerful, employing millions. It's just incomplete.
Definitely incomplete. Understanding these animal spirits, confidence, fairness, corruption, money illusion, and narratives, isn't just optional color commentary. It's essential to explain the actual behavior of economies.
Especially the messy parts.
Especially the messy parts. The volatility, the crashes, the persistent unemployment, why saving is so erratic, why asset bubbles form, even the deep roots of inequality. These psychological forces aren't just nudging things slightly. They can be the primary drivers of major economic events and outcomes, often preventing markets from acting as smoothly or rationally as the simpler models predict.
It's like the standard model describes the engine and the gears of the economy. But the animal spirits are the driver's mood swings, the sudden fog rolling in, the map they're using that might be based on an old legend, and maybe the temptation to just floor it sometimes, regardless of the road conditions.
That's a pretty good analogy, actually, yeah. It helps explain why the economic ride often feels less like a predictable commute and more like a sometimes thrilling, sometimes terrifying roller coaster. You don't always see the forces acting on you until you're plummeting down the drop.
So, here's a final thought for you listening. Given how profoundly these very human psychological factors, these animal spirits, seem to influence huge economic events, How might paying attention to them change the way you look at the economic news?
Hmm.
When you see markets jumping up or down, or hear about unemployment numbers, or watch house prices, are you just seeing the numbers? Or can you start to sense the underlying currents? The whispers of confidence or fear, the arguments about fairness, the shadows of past stories influencing today's choices.
Maybe it even makes you think differently about your own economic decisions, right? About saving or investing. Are they purely rational calculations? Or are your own animal spirits, your hopes, fears, sense of fairness, the stories you tell yourself playing a bigger role than you might think?
Something to watch for. Look for those less obvious, but maybe more powerful drivers shaping the economic world around us.